The anchor chain won't stop talking. Every time the tide shifts, every time the current nudges the hull, even a fraction of a degree, that chain groans against the hawse hole, like something down there is trying to climb it. I've been listening to it for 9 days. I know the difference now between a southeast wind pulling the links taut and a piece of debris bumping the road. I know what a jellyfish sounds like when it slides along the waterline at 2 in the morning. And I know with a certainty that lives in my molars and the backs of my knees, that the sound I heard 40 minutes ago was none of those things. My name is Harlan Brigg. I'm 41 years old. I am sole occupant of the Lady Marceau, a 78-foot steel-hulled shrimp trawler registered out of Bayou La Batterie, Alabama, currently anchored in 11 feet of water about 2 miles off the eastern shore of Galveston Bay. I did not own this boat 9 days ago. I did not know how to operate a marine diesel engine 9 days ago. I certainly did not know that a dead woman could walk through chest-deep salt water without stopping, which is the piece of information that rearranged my entire life and put me on this vessel in the first place. The woman came out of the harbor at Texas City. I was on the seawall at the east end of the dike, trying to get a cell signal, trying to reach my daughter Celia in Baton Rouge, when I saw her waiting. At first, I thought she was one of the evacuees who'd fallen off the overloaded pontoon boats that had been running all night. Then she turned her face toward me, and I had understood that the word evacuee no longer applied. Half her jaw was somewhere else. The rest of her was still committed to arriving. I ran. I'm not proud of it, and I'm not ashamed of it. I ran along the dike until I reached the commercial pier where the Lady Marceau was tied up with her engine idling. Her captain, a man named Tran, was on the dock arguing with 2 men who wanted passage. Tran was saying the fuel was short, saying the shrimp hold was contaminated, saying he couldn't take passengers. The 2 men were holding a woman between them. Alive, conscious, bitten on the forearm. Tran was pointing at the bite. The men were shouting. I went aboard while all 4 of them were facing each other. I went up the ladder to the wheelhouse. I found the throttle because it was the only lever that made sense. I pushed it forward, and the Lady Marceau pulled her own cleats out of the dockwood and left. Tran chased the boat for about 30 feet along the pier. Then he stopped. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know what happened to the 2 men or the bitten woman. I know that the harbor water behind me was no longer empty, that there were more shapes wading out from the shallows near the refinery channel, and that Tran turned around and saw them. I drove the trawler straight out into the bay until the depth finder showed 15 feet, then 10, then 15 again. And I realized I had no idea how to read a channel. I found a patch of open water, killed the engine because I didn't know how much fuel I had, and dropped the anchor by releasing the brake on the windlass, which worked on the same principle as a parking brake in a truck. The chain ran out with a sound like the world unzipping. That was 9 days ago. In that time, I've inventoried every compartment on this boat, taught myself to restart the engine from the manual Tran kept in a plastic sleeve above the helm, caught 11 hardhead catfish and 2 decent speckled trout on hand lines made from the trawl net's bridle wire, and watched the Galveston shoreline burn 3 distinct phases. First, the refineries, then the residential grid behind the seawall, then a long, slow smolder that still puts up a column of brown haze every afternoon, like the island is exhaling its last breath. I have not heard Celia's voice in 12 days. The cell networks collapsed on day 3. The marine radio receives, but my transmissions get no reply. And 40 minutes ago, something grabbed the anchor chain from below and pulled it sideways hard enough to shift the bow 6 inches to port. I'm going to tell you what I think is down there. But first, I need to tell you what I already know is out there. Because what's coming from the water and what's coming from the land are 2 different problems. And I'm running out of ways to be wrong about either one. The Lady Marceau is not a lifeboat. She's a working shrimper, which means she was built to drag heavy nets through warm, shallow water, not to sustain a single human being at anchor indefinitely. But she has qualities I didn't appreciate until I needed them. Her hull is steel, not fiberglass. 3 16-inch plate from the waterline down, with a rubbing strake of angle iron at the gunnel that could open a car door. Her freeboard at the stern, where the trawl deck sits, is only about 4 feet. That's the vulnerability. At the bow, she rides higher, maybe 7 feet from the waterline to the rail. The wheelhouse is elevated another 6 feet on the deckhouse, and the outrigger booms when folded in, create a kind of steel canopy over the main deck that you'd have to be intentional to climb through. I sealed the boat on day 2. That's when I understood this wasn't a 3-day disruption. I welded the trawl deck gate shut using the cutting torch I found in the engine room, then realized welding was an overreaction, and started thinking about what I actually needed, which was early warning, not permanent closure. So I unwelded the gate, rigged it with a latch I could open from the wheelhouse using a rope through a block, and wrapped the stern rail with 3 loops of barbed wire taken from a roll in the lazarette that Tron must have used for dock security in rough ports. The barbed wire is important because on day 4, the first raft arrived. It came from the north, drifting on the outgoing tide, a section of floating dock, the kind marinas use, foam-filled aluminum frames with 7 people on it, 3 men, 2 women, a teenage boy, and a child I couldn't age from a distance. They had no paddles. They were using their hands. One of the men was shouting toward the Lady Marceau, and I could hear individual words blowing apart in the wind before they reached me. Please carried, boat carried, dying carried. I went to the stern rail. I had trans gaff in my hands, a 7-foot aluminum pole with a steel hook, the closest thing to a weapon on this vessel. And I held it across my body like a barrier rather than a tool. The raft was closing, maybe 200 yards. I could see faces now. The child was a girl, maybe 5, sitting in the center of the raft, holding onto a cleat with both fists. The teenage boy had blood on his shirt. One of the women was lying flat. The man who'd been shouting was standing at the leading edge of the raft. He saw the gaff. He raised both hands. He said clearly enough that I caught every syllable across the water. None of us are bit. Check us, please. Just check us. I want to be the person who throws a line without hesitation. I want to be able to tell you I brought them aboard, and we became a crew, and we survived together through the competence and mutual trust. That is not what happened. I told them to hold position. I told them I'd throw a line, but that they'd need to stay on the raft alongside while I checked each person. The man agreed. I threw the line. He caught it on the second toss and made it fast to the raft's cleat. They pulled alongside. I came down to the trawl deck with the gaff, and I looked at each of them through the barbed wire. The teenage boy, his name was Reed, I'd learn later, had blood on his shirt from a nosebleed. No wound. The women were Dolores, who was conscious and dehydrated, and Patrice, who was the one lying flat. Patrice had a gash on her shin from climbing onto the raft. Not a bite. A clean laceration, skin flap, no bruising pattern consistent with teeth. I'd seen enough bite wounds in the previous 36 hours. On television, on the phone videos circulating before the networks died, to know the difference. Bites tear. They don't slice. The 3 men were the shouter, Glenn, and 2 others who gave names I didn't write down, and who would leave the trawler within 48 hours on a skiff we spotted drifting empty past the ship channel. I let them aboard. All 7. The girl's name was Mila. She didn't speak for the first 6 hours. When she finally did, she asked if the boat had a bathroom. And Dolores started crying. That raft group was the first. It was not the last. By day 6, there were 14 people living on the Lady Marceau. The boat was designed for a working crew of 4. Let me describe what 14 people do to a 78-foot trawler. They capsize it. Not literally. Not yet. But in every other way. The freshwater tank held 300 gallons. 14 people drinking a gallon a day in Gulf Coast heat cut that supply to 21 days. Except they weren't drinking a gallon a day. They were drinking 2. Some were pouring it over their heads. I found a man named Collis rinsing his feet with the deck hose on day 5, and I disconnected the hose from the manifold and didn't speak to him for the rest of that day, which was childish and strategic in equal measure, because the Collis was 6'3", and I needed him to understand that water was not a negotiable commodity. The food situation was better than it should have been. The Lady Marceau carried a chest freezer in the galley that Tran had stocked with vacuum-sealed shrimp. His personal take, separate from the commercial catch that went to the processor. There were roughly 80 pounds of frozen shrimp in that freezer, plus canned goods in the pantry locker: beans, hominy, evaporated milk, a case of Vienna sausages, and 16 cans of something labeled in Vietnamese that turned out to be jackfruit and syrup. We also had the bay. I taught Glenn and Reed to use the hand lines, and within 2 days, Reed was out catching me 3-to-1, because he had patience I couldn't manufacture and hands that could feel the difference between a nibble and the current. The people came in 2 more waves after Glenn's raft group. The second was a family of 3 in a bass boat with a functioning outboard: Dale and Yolanda Park, and their son Seb, who was 11 and who had a compound fracture of his left wrist that Dale had splinted with a ruler and electrical tape. The fracture was 5 days old when they arrived. Seb's fingers were swollen and dusky. Yolanda told me a hospital was not an option. I said I knew. Dale asked if I was a doctor. I told him I sold marine insurance in Beaumont, which was true and useless in equal measure. The third wave was the one that changed the arithmetic. A cabin cruiser, maybe 32 feet, running on fumes, carrying 6 adults who'd come from the Kema Marina. The cruiser was too large to raft alongside safely, so I had them anchor 50 yards off and ferry people over in their inflatable dinghy. Among them was a woman named Audra Kessler, who'd been an ER nurse at UTMB Galveston until the hospital was overrun on day 2. Audra came aboard, looked at Seb's wrist, looked at me, and said, "I need a clean surface, boiling water, and whatever passes for a straight edge on this boat." She reset the fracture that evening on the engine room workbench. Seb screamed exactly once, a sound that went out across the flat water and came back to us as a faint echo off the distant shore, as if the bay itself was objecting. Audra splinted it properly using fiberglass from the boat's repair kit and told Dale that his son might keep full use of the hand if they could get to a surgical facility within 2 weeks. Dale nodded, as though 2 weeks were a meaningful unit of time, as though there were surgical facilities accepting patients somewhere in the plausible world. That night, I stood in the wheelhouse and counted the people sleeping below me. 14 bodies in a space built for 4. The engine room had become a dormitory. The galley was a triage station. The foredeck was a latrine schedule. Port side for one group, starboard for the other, a system that worked until the wind shifted. I should have been thinking about leadership, about organization, about long-term survival strategy. Instead, I was thinking about the anchor chain, because twice that day, in broad daylight, I'd felt it shudder in a way that had nothing to do with current or wind. A lateral vibration, a plucked string tremor running up on through the hull and into the soles of my feet. Something was touching the chain below the waterline. Something was testing the connection between this boat and the bottom. I hadn't told anyone. I didn't know how to say it without sounding like the crisis had broken my ability to think clearly. But Audra was in the wheelhouse doorway behind me, and she said, "You felt it too." And it wasn't a question. Audra had a theory, and I didn't want to hear it. But she told me anyway, while we stood in the dark wheelhouse, watching the distant orange glow that used to be the Texas City refinery complex. "The dead," she said, "don't float. Not the fresh ones. Not the ones that are still moving. A living body floats because of air. In the lungs, in the gut. The infected don't breathe. Their buoyancy is negative. They sink. And if they sink, and if they don't stop moving when they're submerged, then every one of them that walked into the water at Texas City, or Galveston, or Kema, or any of the 100 bayou outlets feeding into this bay was now on the bottom, walking. I told her that was speculation. She said the word I was looking for was observation, and that on the last night at UTMB, she'd watched through a third-floor window as a group of infected followed a fleeing ambulance crew down the boat ramp at Pier 21 and never surfaced. Not one. They walked down the ramp's concrete slope, and the water closed over their heads, and they kept going. The headlights of the ambulance, which had been left running, illuminated the first few feet of water, and she could see their shapes descending the incline until the murk swallowed them. They don't need air, she said. They don't need to see. They just need a surface to walk on. And down there, it's flat and hard for miles. Galveston Bay has a mud bottom. In most places, it's soft enough to swallow a crab trap. But the shipping channel is dredged to 45 feet, and the spoil banks on either side create ridges of compacted sediment. Near the ports, near the causeways, near the jetties. The bottom is armored with riprap, broken concrete, limestone, granite. A surface you could walk on, if walking was still something you did. I asked Audra how many had gone into the water. She said she didn't know. She said the population of Galveston Island was 50,000, and the evacuation had been partial at best. She said the causeway had gridlocked within hours, and that most people who couldn't get across had gone to the seawall. And the seawall was where the infected concentrated, because that's where the living concentrated. And the seawall has stairs to the beach every 200 yards, and the beach slopes into the Gulf. But we're in the bay, I said. Not the Gulf. The bay connects to everything, Audra said. The ship channel, the intracoastal, the river mouths. If they're walking on the bottom and they're following the substrate, they'll go wherever the hard ground takes them, and the hard ground under us goes straight to the channel markers. I looked at the depth finder. 11 feet below the keel, the Lady Marceau drew about 5 feet, which meant the bottom was 16 feet below the waterline. A person is roughly 6 feet tall. That left 10 feet of water above the head of anything standing directly beneath us. 10 feet of warm, murky, Gulf-fed water that you couldn't see through past the first 18 inches on a good day. The chain, I said. The chain goes to the bottom, Audra said. It's the only solid vertical object connecting their world to ours. If they're down there and they encounter it, they'll follow it. Not because they're smart. Because it's the only stimulus. It's the only thing to grab. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say this was paranoid extrapolation, that we were safe because we were floating and they were sunk. But I'd felt the chain shudder. I'd felt it that afternoon, while Glenn was cleaning fish on the trawl deck, and Reed was teaching Mila to tie a bowline, and everyone was pretending for 30 minutes that this was a difficult camping trip. I'd felt the vibration, and I'd said nothing. And now Audra was giving the vibration a shape and a direction and a number. And the number was potentially thousands. She asked me how much anchor chain we had out. I said I didn't know. I just released the brake until the boat stopped drifting. She said we needed to know, because the scope of the chain determined how far our anchor was from the boat, and that distance determined how much of a highway we were offering between the bottom and the hull. I said I'd check in the morning. She said the morning was a psychological fiction, and that I should check now. I went to the bow in the dark with a flashlight. I counted the chain markers, painted links at standard intervals. We had approximately 120 feet of chain deployed in 11 feet of water. The ratio was absurd. The chain lay across the bottom in a long catenary, draped over whatever was down there like a handrail in a hallway. We shortened the chain at dawn. Glenn and I operated the windlass manually because I didn't trust the hydraulics not to jam, and because the noise of the electric motor would carry across water in a way I wasn't comfortable with anymore. Sound had become currency. We spent it carefully or not at all. Hand over hand, Glenn cranking the Wildcat while I tailed the slack. We brought in 80 feet of chain and reset the scope to something Audra calculated was still enough to hold in a moderate current, but short enough that the catenary barely touched bottom. The anchor held. The boat swung tighter on her radius, and when the chain came up, I saw what was on it. Not flesh, not fingers, but scratches. Bright parallel marks on the galvanized links, 4 in a row, spaced like the drag of a hand closing. The marks were on 6 consecutive links, about 60 feet down the chain, roughly where it would have been lying on the bottom. Glenn saw them too. He didn't say anything. He set the brake and walked to the galley and poured himself a cup of the cold coffee we'd been rationing and drank it looking at the bulkhead. I found him there 10 minutes later and sat across from him. Glenn was 53, a retired parole officer from Pasadena, Texas, who'd been fishing with his brother when the outbreak hit. His brother had not made it onto the raft. Glenn had a way of processing information that I recognized from my own insurance work. He'd take the data, file it, and respond only when he'd categorize the risk. Right now, he was categorizing. "How many do you think are down there?" he said. "I don't know. Audra thinks there could be a lot." Audra is extrapolating from one observation at one hospital. Audra is the only person on this boat who's seen them in the water. He was right. And I'd been diminishing her assessment because it frightened me, which is the most common and most dangerous form of risk analysis in my professional experience. I'd spent 15 years evaluating hull damage and cargo loss, and the single constant across every bad outcome was an owner who said, "It probably won't happen," while the evidence said it already had. "If they're on the bottom," Glenn said, "and they can grab the chain, can they climb it?" I didn't know. The infected I'd seen on land moved with a kind of deteriorating purpose. They could walk, they could grip, they could bite, but they didn't climb fences or scale walls. They went through doors and windows. They followed openings. Climbing required a coordination that seemed beyond them, based on every video and every first-hand account I'd absorbed in the early days. But those were observations of dry, visible, infected on land. Nobody had data on what they did in water. Nobody had studied them in an environment without gravity's full pull, where buoyancy reduced their effective weight and the chain provided continuous handholds in a vertical line. "We need to see the bottom," I said. Glenn looked at me. "How?" The Lady Marceau had a fish finder, a basic sonar unit mounted in the wheelhouse that Tran used to locate shrimp concentrations. It showed depth contours, and if there were enough objects in the water column, it would paint them as color returns on the screen. I'd been running it passively since day one to monitor depth as the tide shifted. I hadn't been looking at it for contacts. I hadn't been reading the returns between the surface and the bottom because I'd assumed that space was empty. Glenn and I went to the wheelhouse. I turned up the gain on the sonar. The screen refreshed in slow vertical sweeps, painting the water column in shades of blue and yellow. The bottom showed as a solid red band at 16 feet. The surface clutter, waves, bubbles, debris, showed as a thin orange smear at the top. Between them, at roughly 12 to 14 feet of depth, 4 feet off the bottom, roughly head height for a standing human, there were 7 distinct returns, dense, stationary, spaced irregularly across the sonar's cone like objects standing in a loose group. Glenn counted them twice. I counted them 3 times. 7. "They're under us," he said. "They're under us right now." Neither of us had a next sentence. We stood in the wheelhouse and stared at the screen and watched the 7 returns hold their positions with a patience that living things do not possess. I called a meeting on the trawl deck at midday, which was the only space where 14 people could stand without touching each other. The sun was directly overhead, and the heat was a physical weight on every exposed surface. The deck plates radiated through shoe soles. The boom cables were too hot to grip, and the air above the water shimmered in a way that made the distant shore look like it was dissolving. I told them about the sonar returns. I told them about the scratches on the chain. I told them Audra's theory. Then I stopped talking and let the silence do the work I couldn't. Dale Park spoke first. He wanted to know if the things on the bottom could reach the hull. I said the water line was 10 feet above them. He wanted to know if they could stack. I hadn't considered that. The image, bodies climbing on top of bodies in dark water, building a column of dead weight beneath the keel, was so precisely nightmarish that I couldn't process it rationally. Audra said she didn't think they had that kind of collective behavior. They weren't cooperative. They were parallel, each one acting on the same impulse independently. But she said she didn't know. And she said, "I don't know," with a clinical flatness that made it sound more frightening than certainty. Collis, the man I'd caught wasting water, said we should pull anchor and move. Just go. Head out into the Gulf, where it was deep and nothing could reach us. Yolanda Park pointed out that the Gulf was open ocean, and this boat was a bay shrimper, and that deep water meant no anchor, no shore, no fishing, and no protection from weather. Collis said weather was preferable to what was underneath us. Yolanda said he'd never been in a storm on a boat and should stop talking. Reed, the teenager, asked the question that mattered. Are more coming? I didn't know. But the logic was hard to argue with. If the infected were walking on the bottom, and if the anchor chain had been a stimulus that attracted these 7, then the chain would continue to be a stimulus. It was a permanent signal. In an environment without other signals, every infected individual that wandered within contact range of the chain would follow it. The number would grow. The question wasn't whether we were safe at the moment. 10 feet of water and a steel hull were between us and them, but whether that margin would remain sufficient as the population below us increased. We have 3 options, I said. And I laid them out because organizing information into categories is the only professional skill I have, and I wasn't going to apologize for using it. Option 1. Stay and monitor. Keep the sonar running, count the returns, and establish a threshold at which we'd be forced to act. This was the conservative choice, and it had the advantage of costing us nothing except anxiety. Option 2. Relocate within the bay. Pull anchor, motor to a different position farther from shore, and hope the bottom population was localized to the areas near the ports and the causeways. This cost fuel we couldn't replace and put us in unknown water with unknown bottom conditions. Option 3. Establish a second position. Take the park's bass boat, which still had fuel and a functioning outboard, and scout an alternate anchorage while the trawler remained in place. If the alternate was clean, we'd move. If not, we'd have intelligence. Dolores, who'd barely spoken since coming aboard, said there was a 4th option. She said it quietly. She said we could kill them. Go down there and kill them. The trawl deck went silent in a way that was different from the silence after my briefing. That had been absorptive. People taking in information. This was reactive. Everyone was calculating the same thing. Who would go into that water and what they would find? Audra said destroying them underwater would require getting within arm's reach. I said we weren't discussing option 4. Dolores looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Then you'd better hope they can't learn to stack." I chose option 3. Dale agreed. Glenn agreed. Audra abstracted herself from the vote, saying she'd provide medical support for whatever we decided, but wouldn't participate in navigation decisions because she didn't know anything about boats. Reed volunteered to go on the scouting run. I told him no. I told Glenn he was coming with me. I told Audra she was in charge of the trawler until we got back. Audra said, "I'm in charge of medical. Put Dale in charge of the boat." She was right. I'd been organizing, and I'd mistaken organizing for authority, which are not the same thing, and which, in my professional experience, are the exact confusion that sinks vessels and bankrupts companies. Dale took command of the Lady Marceau. Glenn and I took the base boat east toward the Trinity Bay shore at first light the next morning. We brought the gaff, a fire extinguisher, and 16 feet of the anchor chain I'd recovered, coiled in the bow as a weapon of last resort. What we found out there restructured everything I thought I understood about what was happening in this bay. The base boat was a 17-foot aluminum tracker with a 60-horsepower Yamaha that Dale had maintained with the quiet obsession of a man whose weekends depended on it. Glenn drove because he'd grown up running these waters and could read the oyster reefs by the color of the surface, a skill I didn't possess and couldn't fake. We left the trawler at dawn with the sun behind us and the bay ahead, and for the first 20 minutes, it was almost possible to believe the world was merely empty rather than ended. The water was calm. The sky was the white blue of a Gulf Coast morning before the heat builds. Pelicans flew in their heavy diagonal lines above the ship channel markers, and I realized they were the first birds I'd consciously noticed in days. Life was still happening out here. The bay was still an ecosystem. The things on the bottom hadn't changed that. Or hadn't changed it yet. Glenn kept us in the shallows, following the north shore of the bay toward Smith Point. The plan was to check the area around the mouth of the Trinity River, where the bottom was soft mud and the water was fresher. Conditions Audra theorized might be less hospitable to the infected, though she'd been clear that this was a guess built on the assumption that decomposition would be accelerated in lower salinity. We were navigating by hypothesis. It was all we had. 40 minutes out, Glenn cut the engine and pointed. Ahead of us, maybe 300 yards, a cluster of boats sat at anchor in a loose congregation. I counted 8 vessels. A mixture of recreational boats, one sailboat with its mast broken at the spreaders, and 2 flat-bottomed barges that it looked like they'd been lashed together with cable. People were visible on the barges. Movement, color, vertical human shapes doing human things. "That's a settlement," Glenn said. He was right. It had the look of something organized. The barges formed a central platform. The boats were arranged in a rough perimeter, and I could see what appeared to be a tarp shelter rigged over the barge deck. Someone had thought about this. Someone had done what we'd done, but with more resources and more people. Glenn wanted to approach. I wanted to observe. We argued briefly and compromised by idling forward at trolling speed, with my hand on the gaff and Glenn's on the tiller. At 200 yards, a man on the nearest barge raised a pair of binoculars and watched us. At 100 yards, he raised a rifle. Glenn cut the engine. We drifted. The man with the rifle didn't speak. A second person appeared beside him. A woman, older, wearing a sun hat that belonged at a garden party. She cupped her hands and shouted across the water, "How many are you?" 2 in this boat, Glenn called back. 14 on a trawler 2 miles west. A pause. The woman conferred with the rifleman. Then she shouted, "Anyone sick?" "No." "Anyone bit?" "No." "Come alongside the port barge. Keep your hands visible. We'll throw you a line." Her name was Vivian Cortez, and she'd been the harbor master at the Anahuac Marina until the marina ceased to exist. The rifleman was her nephew, Marco, 26, National Guard reservist, who'd been on leave when his unit was overrun at the Galveston Causeway checkpoint. The settlement, they called it the Float, held 31 people across the 8 vessels. They'd been there since day 3. Vivian gave us water, actual clean water, from a reverse osmosis desalinator she'd pulled from a seized yacht. She gave us information, which was worth more. The Float had a marine radio that could reach a relay station on a platform in the Gulf. An oil rig, she said, partially staffed, running on backup generators, serving as a communication hub for scattered survivor groups along the coast. Through that relay, Vivian had pieced together a picture of the outbreak's scope that was broader and more specific than anything I'd been able to assemble from shore fire smoke and sonar shadows. The infection had reached the coast from the interior, moving south along the I-45 corridor from Houston. Houston was gone. Not burning, not fighting, just gone. A silent grid with 7 million vectors moving through it. The military had established a perimeter at the Brazos River to the west and the Sabine to the east. But the perimeter was for containment, not rescue. No one was coming into the bay. No one was coming for us. And then Vivian told us about the water. The Float had lost a boat. 5 days before our arrival, the 24-foot center console anchored at the perimeter of the settlement had sunk overnight. Not capsized, sunk. It went down by the stern in calm water, with no storm No collision, no mechanical failure that anyone could identify. The two people sleeping aboard had woken when the deck went awash and had been pulled onto the nearest barge by Marco, who'd been on watch. In the morning, when the sun was high enough to penetrate the first few feet of water, Marco had looked over the side of the barge and seen the center console sitting upright on the bottom in 9 feet of water. And he'd seen what was on it. They were standing on the gunnels, 4 of them, positioned around the boat's perimeter as though they'd surrounded it and then pulled it down by the collective weight. Their feet were on the fiberglass, and their arms were at their sides, and they were motionless, standing in the silty green light, with small fish moving around them. Marco said they looked like passengers waiting for a bus. Vivian had ordered the settlement to shift position. They'd moved a 1/4 mile north into shallower water, where the bottom was softer and the mud might inhibit movement. But 3 days later, the sonar on the sailboat, which had a more sophisticated unit than our fish finder, showed returns beneath them again. Different ones. More. 11 contacts at the new position compared to 4 at the old one. They're not following us, Vivian said. They're everywhere. The entire bottom of this bay is populated. She said it the way you'd report a weather condition. Not with fear, but with the administrative weariness of someone who has integrated the information and moved on to logistics. The fear was Marco's department. He sat on an overturned bucket at the edge of our conversation and cleaned the rifle and didn't look at the water. Glenn asked how deep the contacts were, whether there was a depth threshold below which they didn't appear. Vivian said the float sonar had picked them up in everything from 6 to 22 feet. The shallow ones were the most unnerving because in 6 feet of water, a standing figure's head was only inches below the surface. One of the float's residents, a shrimper named Petey, claimed he'd seen a face just below the waterline at dusk. Just a face, eyes open, looking up. Petey had not been on watch since. I told Vivian about our own sonar returns, about the scratches on the chain, about Audra's theory of bottom walking. Vivian nodded, as though I were confirming something she already knew. The question isn't whether they're down there, she said. The question is, what triggers them to reach up? She had a theory of her own, and hers was built on more data than ours. The center console had sunk on a night when the generator on the main barge had been running. An unusual occurrence, since they normally conserved fuel. The generator vibrated. Vibration traveled through the hull into the water. The infected, Vivian believed, responded to sustained vibration because it was the most detectable signal in a medium where vision was useless, and sound propagated 4 times faster than in air. Every time you run your engine, she told me, you're ringing a dinner bell on the bottom of the bay. I thought about the 9 days I'd spent on the Lady Marceau. I'd run the engine twice. Once to test the restart procedure, once to charge the batteries. Both times for 20 minutes. Both times the vibration would have traveled through the steel hull and into the water column, like a broadcast, like a signal, like an invitation. The ones under you right now, Vivian said. You called them there. Glenn and I looked at each other across the barge deck. The sun was high and hot, and the water around the float was flat and opaque, and every square foot of its surface was a ceiling above a room we couldn't see. Vivian offered us a deal. The float had desalinated water and radio communication, and 31 people with a reasonable distribution of useful skills. What they didn't have was a vessel with the structural integrity to withstand a sustained assault from below. The barges were flat-bottomed and welded steel, but they sat low in the water. 2 feet of freeboard at most. The recreational boats were fiberglass, which could be breached. The Lady Marceau, with her heavy steel hull and higher freeboard, was the most defensible platform in the bay. Combine, Vivian said. Bring your trawler here, or we'll come to you. But either way, we pool resources, and we stop pretending we can handle this in small groups. Glenn said yes immediately. I said I needed to talk to the people on the trawler first. Vivian studied me for a moment that lasted longer than comfort permitted and said, You're the one who stole the boat, aren't you? I secured it. You stole it. And now you think it's yours, and you get to decide who comes aboard. I didn't answer because she was right and wrong simultaneously. And the ratio between those two was the thing I'd been refusing to calculate since day one. Glenn and I ran back to the Lady Marceau in the late afternoon with the sun in our eyes and the bay surface turned to copper. I drove, and Glenn sat in the bow watching the water ahead, which was something we hadn't felt the need to do on the outbound trip, but which now seemed necessary for reasons neither of us articulated. The water ahead was just water, but water was no longer just water. We arrived to find the trawler in crisis. Not the crisis I'd anticipated. Not a breach from below, not a chain failure, not an infected hand reaching over the stern rail. A human crisis. Seb Park's broken wrist had developed an infection. Audra had identified it by the red streaking up his forearm, by the fever that had spiked to 103, and by the smell. She'd opened the splint, cleaned the wound, and applied the last of the antibiotic ointment from the first aid kit. But she told me privately that ointment was not what this required. This required intravenous antibiotics, and without them, the infection would go systemic within days. Sepsis, she said. In an 11-year-old. On a shrimp boat, I can keep him hydrated and manage his fever, but I cannot cure this with what I have. Dale was sitting beside his son in the engine room, holding a wet cloth to the boy's forehead with the focused delicacy of a man diffusing ordnance. Yolanda was standing in the passageway outside, and the look on her face was the one I'd been seeing in variations since this started. The expression of someone doing arithmetic with numbers that don't resolve. I told Dale about the float, about Vivian, the radio relay, the oil platform, the desalinator, about the offer to combine groups. Dale listened without removing the cloth from Seb's forehead and said, "Do they have medicine?" I didn't ask. Then ask. Audra took the marine radio and began broadcasting on the channel Vivian had given us. It took 40 minutes to establish contact because Vivian's radio operator, a retired Coast Guard communications specialist named Fry, kept a monitored schedule rather than continuous watch. When they connected, Audra described Seb's condition with a precision that made the medical situation legible to anyone listening. Compound fracture, secondary infection, cellulitis progressing to potential septicemia, pediatric patient, no IV access, no antibiotics beyond topical. Fry relayed the information to the oil platform. The platform relayed it outward, and an hour later, a voice came back on the radio that was not Vivian's, not Fry's, and not from the platform. "Lady Marceau, this is the vessel King Post. We are a Coast Guard response cutter operating out of Port Arthur. We have medical supplies including broad-spectrum IV antibiotics. We can rendezvous at your position in approximately 14 hours. Confirm your coordinates and the number of persons requiring evacuation. Over." The wheelhouse went silent. Audra held the microphone and looked at me, and I looked at Glenn, and Glenn looked at Dale, who had come up from the engine room when he heard the word antibiotics, and was standing in the wheelhouse doorway with Seb's fever still on his hands. "Evacuation," Dale said. They said evacuation. I took the microphone from Audra. "King Post, this is Lady Marceau. 14 persons aboard, 1 requiring urgent medical care. Confirm you said evacuation. What is the destination? Over." A pause, static. The gulf breathing through the speaker. "Lady Marceau. Destination is a secure anchorage at Sabine Pass, military-administered safe zone. We are conducting coastal sweeps for survivor groups. Your signal was relayed through the offshore platform network. Be advised, we will arrive at your position at approximately 0600 tomorrow. Prepare all persons for transfer. You will not be returning to your vessel. Over." Not returning to the vessel. I looked around the wheelhouse. At the helm where I taught myself to read the depth finder. At the manual in its plastic sleeve. At the coffee mug Glenn had been using for 6 days, with the faded shrimp logo on the side. I looked at the sonar screen, which was still running, and I counted the returns below us. The number was no longer 7. The number Was 19. Copy, King Post, I said. We'll be ready. Dale went back down to his son. Audra started organizing the medical supplies she'd want to bring. Glenn went to the bow and stood looking east, toward Sabine, toward the place where the military had drawn a line and said this far and no farther. And I went to the trawl deck and looked over the stern rail into the water that was turning dark as the sun dropped. And I thought about what Vivian had said, that every time we ran the engine, we rang a bell on the bottom. The King Post would arrive running twin diesels at cruising speed. The vibration signature of a Coast Guard cutter entering our anchorage would be the loudest thing this part of the bay had heard in 9 days. I went back inside and picked up the microphone and called the float. Vivian answered on the second call. I told her about the King Post, about the evacuation, about Sabine Pass. She already knew. Fry had intercepted the relay before it reached us, and the float had been in direct contact with the cutter for the past 3 hours. The King Post was coming for all of us. The float and the Lady Marceau, both. The plan was to collect the float first, since they were farther east and closer to the cutter's approach route, then proceed to our position for the second pickup. That's a lot of engine noise in one bay, I said. Vivian's pause told me she'd already had this conversation with someone else. Fry raised the same concern. The cutter's captain is aware of the subsurface situation. They've encountered it at other locations along the coast. Encountered it, and it how? They lost a rigid inflatable in Matagorda Bay. Sent it in to pick up survivors from a sailboat. The inflatable was swamped from below while stationary. 3 crew in the water, 1 recovered. I sat with that. A military crew, trained and equipped, had lost people to the same phenomenon we'd been monitoring with a shrimp boat fish finder. The captain's plan, Vivian continued, is to keep the cutter moving at all times. No anchoring, no station keeping. They'll come alongside at speed. We transfer while underway. And they don't stop until they're out of the bay and into the intracoastal. Alongside at speed, I repeated. With children and injured people. The alternative is they anchor and we find out what 19 or 90 infected can do to a stationary hull. She was right. The choice was between a dangerous transfer and a potentially catastrophic one. I told her we'd be ready. The night before the King Post arrived was the longest I spent on the Lady Marceau. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone did, though for different reasons. Dale and Yolanda were with Seb, whose fever had not broken and whose arm was now swollen past the elbow. Audra circulated between Seb and the wheelhouse, checking the sonar every 30 minutes and recording the count on a piece of cardboard torn from a shrimp box. At midnight, 22. At 2 a.m., 26. At 4, 31. They were accumulating. Whatever residual vibration the trawler put into the water through the generator, the bilge pump, the simple mechanical presence of 14 human beings moving on a steel platform. It was drawing them in. The anchor chain was their landmark, their waypoint, the thing that told them something was above. And now 31 of them stood beneath us in the warm, dark water, faces angled upward by the buoyancy they no longer needed, arms drifting at their sides in the tidal current, waiting with the inexhaustible patience of things that had no competing demands on their time. Reed found me on the foredeck at 4:30. The stars were still out, but the eastern horizon had a gray quality that meant dawn was coming. He sat down cross-legged on the deck and said, "I've been thinking about the chain. What about it? When the cutter comes and we leave, the chain stays. The anchor stays. Everything below us stays. Yes. So the next boat that comes here, that anchors in this spot, they won't know." He was 15. He was thinking about the people who would come after us, about the information we'd be taking with us when we left. I hadn't considered it. I'd been so focused on the extraction that I'd forgotten the bay would remain, and the things in it would remain, and the absence of our knowledge would be a kind of violence against whoever arrived next. "We should leave a marker," Reed said. "Something on the chain. Something that says, 'Don't anchor here.' We're pulling the anchor when we leave." "Are we?" "The cutter isn't stopping. We're transferring underway. Are you going to have time to pull 120 feet of chain while matching speed with a military vessel? He was right. The anchor would stay. The chain would stay. And the 31 shapes below us would stand there in the current and wait for the next vibration, the next signal, the next connection between their world and ours. I told Reed we'd figure something out. He looked at me with the particular skepticism of a teenager who has heard adults say we'll figure something out enough times to know it means we won't. Audra came to the foredeck with the latest count. 34. 3 more in 30 minutes. The tide was incoming, pushing bay water in from the Gulf. And I wondered if the current was carrying them. Not swimming, not navigating. Just being transported by the water the way sediment is transported. The dead drifting along the bottom until they encountered something solid and stopped. How many can the bottom hold? I asked Audra. It was a nonsensical question, but she treated it seriously. The bottom can hold every person who died in every city that drains into this bay, she said. Houston alone had over 2 million in the metro. If even 5% reached the water, don't finish that math. She didn't need to. 100,000 figures walking the substrate of Galveston Bay, dispersed across 600 square miles of shallow, warm, opaque water. Not concentrated, not organized, just distributed. Like a minefield. Like a probability field. And every anchor, every engine, every hull was a node of attraction, pulling them out of their random dispersal and into local density. The eastern sky turned pink. Somewhere beyond the curvature of the bay, the King Post was running toward us. At 6:12 a.m., I saw the cutter. She appeared as a gray shape against the Bolivar Peninsula, moving fast, trailing a white wake that caught the low sun and turned it into a line of fire across the water. She was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 150 feet, with a high bow and a low stern platform and a superstructure bristling with antennae that made her look like she was listening to everything simultaneously. Audra was on the radio with the cutter's medical officer, relaying Seb's vitals. Dale had Seb wrapped in a blanket on the trawl deck, ready to move. Yolanda had their bag. One bag, a duffel, containing everything they'd saved from their previous life. Mila was holding Dolores's hand with the grip strength of a child who has learned that letting go has permanent consequences. Reed stood at the bow watching the cutter approach, and I stood beside him, and neither of us said what we were both calculating, which was the acoustic footprint of a 600-ton vessel moving at 15 knots through 11 feet of water. The cutter altered course toward us. On the sonar, the count was 41. Glenn was at the helm, engine running. Another bell, another signal, but necessary now, because we'd need to match the cutter's speed for the transfer. I'd briefed everyone on the procedure Vivian had relayed. The cutter would come alongside our port side at reduced speed, approximately 5 knots. We'd match heading and velocity. The cutter's crew would extend a boarding ramp from their stern platform to our trawl deck. We'd cross one at a time, injured first, children second. Estimated transfer window, 4 minutes. The cutter would not stop. We would not stop. The Lady Marceau would be abandoned underway and left adrift until she grounded on a shoal or was carried out to sea. The cutter was half a mile out when the radio crackled and a voice I hadn't heard before said, "Lady Marceau, King Post actual. Be advised we are observing significant subsurface activity on our approach sonar. Numerous contacts rising from the bottom along our track. Recommend you begin making way immediately. Do not wait for us to arrive at your position. Proceed east at best speed, and we will overtake and match. Acknowledge." Rising from the bottom, along their track, the cutter's engine noise and hull vibration were pulling them up the way our anchor chain had been a highway. But not a highway this time. A trigger. The sound and pressure wave of the cutter was waking them from their standing dormancy, and they were doing what we'd feared, what Dolores had named, what none of us had wanted to model. They were reaching up. Glenn didn't wait for me to relay the order. He'd heard it through the open wheelhouse door, and he pushed the throttle forward, and the Lady Marceau's diesel roared to life with a shudder that went through every plate and frame and rivet. The bow swung east. The anchor chain, still deployed, went taut against our forward motion, and the boat lurched, and I heard the windlass brake groan. "The chain!" Reed shouted. I ran forward. The windlass brake was slipping. The chain was pulling the boat down as we tried to drag the anchor across the bottom. I grabbed the brake handle and released it fully, not to pull the anchor, but to let the chain run, let it pay out until we had enough slack to move. But there was no more chain. We'd shortened it. There were only 40 feet deployed, and the anchor was set hard in the mud, and the Lady Marceau was fighting her own ground tackle. Glenn reversed the engine, surged forward again, and the anchor broke free with a sound like a gunshot transmitted through the hull. The chain went slack, the bow rose, and we began moving east at 6 knots, with the anchor dragging below us like a fishhook trolling the bottom of the bay. On the sonar screen, the returns were no longer stationary. They were moving, drifting to port, which meant we were passing over them, or they were falling behind, and this was the possibility that made my hands shake on the rail. They were being pulled along the bottom by the anchor chain that was now dragging through their midst like a plow through standing wheat. The cutter was closing from the west, overtaking us, her bow wave visible now as a white wall of displaced water. Behind the cutter, in the sonar shadow we couldn't see, I imagined the bottom of the bay in motion. A slow, stirred procession of upright figures turning toward the sound, lifting their arms against the current, beginning the vertical journey from substrate to surface. We had minutes, maybe less. The king post came alongside at 7 knots. I know the speed because the cutter's loudspeaker announced it. "Match 7 knots, Lady Marceau. Hold your heading." And Glenn held the helm with both hands and kept us parallel, while the gray hull of the cutter slid into position 20 feet off our port side. The scale difference was staggering. The cutter's deck was higher than our wheelhouse. Her crew looked down at us the way you'd look into a bathtub. The boarding ramp extended from the cutter's stern platform, a ribbed aluminum gangway, with rope railings that 2 sailors pushed out over the gap between the vessels. It landed on our port gunwale with a clang that I felt in my sternum. A sailor at the far end shouted, "Send your injured first. Move fast. We are not stopping." Dale carried Seb across. The boy was semi-conscious, wrapped in the blanket, his splinted arm cradled against Dale's chest. Dale walked the ramp without looking down at the water churning between the hulls and handed his son to a medic on the cutter's platform, and then turned back for Yolanda. And then the 3 of them were gone, absorbed into the cutter's interior, and I realized I might never see them again in any context where we'd have time to speak. Mila went next, carried by Dolores, who was crying and moving and not letting the tears slow her steps. Patrice followed, limping on her healed shin. Reed went. I watched him step onto the ramp and pause for 1 second, just one, to look back at the trawler, at the gaff still leaning against the wheelhouse door, at the hand line he'd rigged to the stern cleat. Then he crossed. Collis went. The Kema group went, one by one, efficient, terrified, alive. Audra was organizing the flow, standing at the ramp's foot on our side, counting, directing, keeping space between each person so the ramp didn't overload. She was the last skill standing between order and panic, and she wielded it without flourish. Glenn came down from the wheelhouse. The Lady Marceau was still making way under throttle. Glenn had lashed the helm with a bungee cord, a crude autopilot that would hold course for maybe 90 seconds before the current took us. He crossed the ramp fast, his boots loud on the aluminum. And then it was me and Audra on a trawler that was driving itself east at 7 knots with a dragging anchor harvesting the bottom. "Go," I said. "You first," Audra said. "I don't trust you not to stay." "Why would I stay?" "Because you stole this boat, and it's the only thing you've controlled since the world ended. And letting go of it means admitting you don't have a next move." She was speaking fast because we were running out of ramp time. The cutter was beginning to edge ahead of us as the trawler slowed, the lashed helm drifting, the gap between the vessels widening by inches. She was also speaking accurately, I stepped onto the ramp. Audra stepped on behind me. I was 3 steps from the cutter when I felt the ramp shudder, and I looked down between the hulls into the white water being generated by the 2 vessels running in parallel. And in that turbulence, I saw a hand, not reaching for me, not reaching for anything, just there, in the churn, fingers extended, rolling in the prop wash like a glove dropped in a river. And behind it, in the deeper water beneath the hulls, there were shapes, vertical, tumbling, dragged along by the current the ships were generating, a school of them being swept through the gap between the vessels, the way debris is swept through a sluice. The cutter's sailors pulled me aboard. They pulled Audra aboard. The ramp retracted. The Lady Marceau fell behind, her bow already drifting south as the lashed helm lost its authority, her engine still running, her anchor still dragging, still ringing the bell on the bottom for whatever was left to hear it. I stood on the cutter's stern platform and watched the trawler shrink. Behind it, the bay was flat and calm and revealed nothing of what was underneath. And I understood that this was the fundamental deception of water. It shows you only its surface. And the surface is a lie, and every decision we'd made had been based on the lie because we'd had no way to see through it until the sonar told us what we'd been floating above all along. The cutter turned south toward the Intracoastal. The bay fell behind. The shrimp boat that I'd stolen and lived on and thought of as mine became a speck and then a suggestion and nothing. And below us, all the way to Sabine, the bottom was not empty. The Intracoastal waterway is a ditch. I don't mean that dismissively. It's a dredged channel, straight and narrow and walled on both sides by spoil banks that rise 6 to 8 feet above the waterline and block any view of the surrounding landscape. Running the Intracoastal in the King Post was like driving through a trench. The sky was a strip above us, and the banks scrolled past on either side, and the water beneath the hull was 12 feet deep. And I could not stop thinking about what 12 feet of water contained now. The cutter's captain, a woman named Lieutenant Commander Okoro, briefed us in the mess compartment while we were underway. She was compact, precise, and had the specific exhaustion of someone who has been making consequential decisions without pause for longer than the human nervous system is designed to support. She told us the Sabine Pass safe zone was established by elements of the Texas National Guard and the Coast Guard 4 days after the outbreak reached the coast. It occupied both banks of the Sabine River at its mouth, using the existing jetty system as a defensive perimeter. Population as of her last communication: approximately 400 civilians and 60 military personnel. She told us the safe zone was not permanent. It was a staging point. The military was planning a larger evacuation by sea to offshore platforms and ultimately to secure facilities in Florida. But the timeline was uncertain because every maritime movement attracted subsurface attention. The bottom of every waterway between here and the Mississippi is compromised, Okoro said. We can move, but we can't stop. The moment we go stationary in anything under 30 feet of water, they begin to accumulate. In deep water, the Gulf, past the continental shelf, we're clear. But the inshore waters, the bays, the rivers, anything shallow enough for them to stand in, is occupied. She let that sink in. Glenn, sitting beside me, was doing the same filing and categorizing process I'd watched him perform on the trawler. Audra was listening with her ER triage focus, absorbing data for immediate application. What about the jetties? I asked. At Sabine Pass. The safe zone is on a river. That's shallow water. Okoro nodded. The jetties are armored with granite blocks, and we maintain a continuous noise perimeter, underwater acoustic deterrents that interfere with their ability to localize our position. It's not perfect. We lose the deterrent signal during equipment rotation, and we've had incursions during those windows. Incursions, Audra repeated. They come up the jetty rocks the way they walk up a boat ramp. Out of the water, onto the rocks, over the wall. The granite gives them purchase. We've reinforced with concertina wire and we have designated kill teams. But it's a daily maintenance problem. Daily maintenance. The eradication of reanimated human beings described in the language of groundskeeping. I looked around the mess compartment at the 14 people from the Lady Marceau, at the 31 from the float who'd been collected before us and who now occupied the forward berthing spaces. 45 civilians delivered into a safe zone that was itself under daily siege, in a body of water that was itself the threat, defended by equipment that required rotation and maintenance and power. Viviane was across the compartment, talking to Dale. She caught my eye and held it, and I saw in her expression the same assessment I was making. We had traded one untenable position for a larger, better resourced, untenable position. The arithmetic had improved. The fundamental equation had not. Reed appeared beside me. He'd been up on deck watching the intracoastal scroll past, and he had the particular alertness of someone who'd seen something and was deciding whether to report it. "There's a boat ahead," he said. "Grounded on the south bank. Small. Looks like a John boat. Lots of abandoned boats out here. This one has a person in it. Sitting up, not moving." I went topside. The John boat was visible 200 yards ahead, canted on the spoil bank with its bow in the mud and its stern still into the water. There was indeed a figure in it, sitting upright in the middle bench seat, hands on the gunnels, facing the waterway. The King Post's bridge crew had already spotted it. I could see sailors on the bow with binoculars. We passed the John boat at 8 knots. At closest approach, maybe 40 yards, I could see the figure clearly. A man, middle-aged, wearing a life jacket. His eyes were open. His mouth was closed. He did not track the cutter as we passed. He did not move at all. But he was completely dry. The life jacket, his clothes, his hair, all dry. He'd been sitting there long enough for the sun to dry him, which meant he'd come out of the water, which meant the water had given him back. I watched him until the bend in the waterway took him out of sight, and I carried the image forward into whatever came next. A man in a boat, perfectly still, returned from below, sitting in the sun as though waiting for something he was no longer equipped to name. The Sabine Pass safe zone appeared as a break in the monotony of the intracoastal, a widening where the waterway met the river, a sudden openness after miles of trench. The jetties extended seaward like two long arms reaching into the Gulf, and between them, the river mouth churned with tidal exchange, brown water mixing with blue in a visible line that curled and shifted with the current. On both banks, behind walls of stacked shipping containers and coils of concertina wire, I could see structures, tents, prefab shelters, a crane that had been repurposed to hoist supplies from boats to the elevated bank. People moved between the structures. Vehicles were parked in organized rows. A generator hummed somewhere with the steady pulse of maintained infrastructure. The King Post slowed but did not stop. She nosed into the river mouth at 3 knots, and a pilot boat, a small aluminum workboat with 2 armed sailors, came alongside to guide us to a floating dock that extended from the north jetty. The dock was temporary, built from pontoon sections lashed together, and it flexed under the cutter's wake as we approached. Sailors on the dock caught our lines. The cutter nudged the pontoon and held position with her engines, not tying off, not going stationary, just pressing gently against the dock while we disembarked. I stepped off the King Post and onto the floating dock and felt it move beneath me and understood that I had not stood on anything truly stable in 9 days. The dock led to a ramp. The ramp led to the jetty. The jetty led to solid ground. Actual earth. Compacted and graded, smelling of diesel and mud and the particular tang of the Sabine marshes. I stood on it and felt my knees lock and my balance recalibrate from the constant micro-adjustment of a hull in water to the fixed geometry of land. Audra was beside me. She was looking at the medical tent, visible by its Red Cross flag, and already moving toward it. Dale and Yolanda were ahead of her, Seb on a stretcher carried by 2 cutter crew. The boy was conscious now, his eyes open and glassy with fever, but conscious. And when the stretcher bearers carried him through the tent flap, He raised his good hand in a small wave that might have been directed at anyone or no one. Glenn found me on the jetty. He'd been one of the last off the cutter, and he had Tran's manual in his hand. The plastic-sleeved engine manual from the Lady Marceau's wheelhouse. He'd taken it. I hadn't thought to take anything. Souvenir, he said, and tucked it into his jacket. The safe zone was more organized than I'd expected. Okoro's 60 military personnel were supplemented by civilian volunteers who'd been assigned roles based on skill. There was a water purification station, a food distribution point, a communications shack with antennae tall enough to be visible from the river. There was a perimeter watch with overlapping fields of fire covering the jetties and the riverbank. There was, improbably, a school. 3 children sitting on a tarp under a lean-to while a woman with a whiteboard taught them something I couldn't see from where I stood. And there was the sound, a low, pulsing drone, coming from below the jetty. The acoustic deterrent Okoro had described. It vibrated through the granite rocks and into the soles of my feet, a sensation not unlike standing on the Lady Marceau when the engine was running. The sound was designed to confuse and repel the subsurface infected, to scramble whatever rudimentary stimulus response mechanism drove them toward vibration. It was, in effect, noise cancellation. Fighting signal with counter signal, rendering the safe zone acoustically invisible to the things in the river. Viviane appeared at my side. She'd been processed through intake already. The float's advance group had been logged and assigned quarters before we arrived. She looked different on land, smaller. The authority she'd carried on the barge, the harbor master's command presence, was recalibrated by the presence of a larger system. She was no longer the person in charge. None of us were. Fry got a relay through to Baton Rouge, she said. I stopped walking. What? The platform network connects to a ham radio relay that covers Louisiana. Fry reached an operator in Lake Charles who patched through to a functioning cell tower in Baton Rouge. He got a list of names and locations for the Baton Rouge Evacuation Center. My daughter, Celia, 23 years old, graduate student at LSU, last contacted 12 days ago when the cell networks were still intermittent, and she'd sent a text that said, "Dad, I'm okay, campus is locked down, don't come," and then silence. Is she on the list? Vivian handed me a piece of paper. It was a printout. Actual printed paper from an actual printer, one of the small miracles of maintained infrastructure. A list of names, alphabetical. 3 columns per page. I scanned the B's. My hands were shaking in a way they hadn't shaken when I saw the sonar returns, or the hand in the prop wash, or the man in the John boat. Brig, Brig, Brig. Brig, Celia M. Baton Rouge Convention Center. Status, active. Active, alive. Present and accounted for in a building I could name on a street I could picture in a city I could, theoretically, reach. I sat down on the jetty. The granite was warm from the sun. The acoustic deterrent pulsed through the stone. The river moved past, brown and flat and full of things I could no longer see. And my daughter was alive. And I was holding a piece of paper that proved it. And the distance between us was 200 miles of compromised waterway and occupied ground. But she was alive. And the distance was a problem. And problems, unlike apocalypses, have solutions. Glenn sat down beside me. He didn't ask what was on the paper. He could see it on my face. Now what? He said. I looked east, up the Sabine, toward Louisiana. Now I figure out how to get to Baton Rouge, through whatever's between here and there. Glenn nodded. He opened Tran's engine manual and smoothed it on his knee, as if reviewing the specifications for a journey that didn't exist yet. In a vessel we no longer possessed, across water we now understood was not the barrier we believed in, but the medium through which the crisis moved. You'll need a boat, he said. The safe zone gave us ground. It gave Seb antibiotics and Mila a place to sleep without the sound of chain. It gave Audra patients she could actually treat, and Reed a whiteboard where he mapped tidal patterns for the perimeter watch. It gave me a piece of paper with my daughter's name on it. And that piece of paper became the most dangerous object in my possession because it gave me a reason to leave safety. I am writing this from the communications shack at Sabine Pass on day 14. The acoustic deterrent is pulsing through the floor. The river is calm. Somewhere below its surface, in the silt and the current and the darkness, they stand in their patient rows and wait for the signal to falter. Tomorrow, Glenn and I take a shallow draft skiff up the Intracoastal toward Calcasieu. Vivian has plotted the route through the platform relay network. Audra has packed a medical kit. Reed has asked to come. I told him no. He accepted it the way he accepts everything, with a skepticism that is, itself, a form of trust. The water is not empty. I know that now. The water was never empty. It only looked that way from above.